The mud flaps, which are provided with many model truck kits, tend to be a little on the heavy side in terms of thickness, and often the mounting hardware is rather simplified compared to the one-to-one counterparts. As an example, this style of coiled square bar, shown here on a real truck, is very common in one-to-one scale, but is rather impractical to reproduce in model form in injection molded plastic. The coiled end absorbs vibration and road shock and fits into a cast bracket bolted to the frame, secured with a cotter pin for easy replacement. The mud flap itself is bolted to flat bar tabs that are bent around the square bar. A 1/25th scale model version can easily be created using K&S 1/32 square brass bar. Step 1 is to anneal a section of the brass bar by heating it up with a propane torch until it's red hot and letting it cool gradually. This softens the brass enough that it can be easily wound into a tight coil around a piece of 3/32 brass tube to create the coiled end as shown here. This is the bracket for the left side of the truck. Remember to create one that's opposite-handed to use on the right side. Strips cut from 5/1000 shim brass will be used to represent the bent flap bars which the mud flap bolts to. Here, the midsection of each strip has been tinned with a small layer of solder, along with the top surface of the mud flap bracket itself. 5/1000 shim brass cuts well with a hobby knife and straight edge, and strips of consistent width are easily achieved with a jig like this, made of a piece of brass strip, soldered to a sheet of copper. Using the brass strip soldered to the copper sheet as an alignment guide, the sheet you're cutting strips from, a spacer, and the straight edge are all pressed into place to set the width of the strip. Here I'm using 60 by 60 square styrene. Carefully remove the spacer, leaving the straight edge at the desired width, and carefully cut the strip off using several light passes with a hobby knife. The result will be a clean strip of 60 wide, 5 thick shim brass. Solder the strips to the square bar by clamping the parts down with the tin surfaces in contact and applying heat with a soldering gun. I find that using magnets on a flat steel surface works very well to hold these small brass parts together for soldering. When all the strips have been soldered in place, you should end up with something that looks like a little brass centipede. Clean up any excess solder to prepare the part for the next step, which is bending the strips around both sides of the square bar. The 30 by 60 styrene strip I'm using as a spacer both matches the thickness of the square bar, and it acts as a guide to cut each of the tabs off at the correct length once they're bent. Here, all 4 tabs have been bent on one side of the square bar, and my next step will be to use a chisel blade in the hobby knife to cut each tab off flush with the edge of the styrene strip. When that is done, I'll bend the other side of the tabs over and then flip the bracket itself around and cut off the excess length of those strips. The end result is a good representation of a coiled square bar mounting bracket with 4 bent flat bar tabs to which a mud flap will be bolted. I like the Ford logo on the kit supplied mud flaps, so I cut the mud flaps free from the kit provided hanger and sanded the overscale thickness down slightly till it was 30/1000 of an inch wide to match the square bar. Drill through the shim brass tabs and into the mud flap to provide holes for brass wire pins that will simulate the mounting bolts. Inserting 20 brass wire through the drilled holes not only looks like bolts, it also acts like bolts by creating a mechanical connection which is much stronger than relying on a simple glued joint. A small drop of CA glue is useful to secure the pins in place, and then they can be cut off to the desired length using flush cutting pliers. Paint and weather the mud flap and hanger to suit, and build the mounting bracket on the frame from a short piece of 1/16 square tube soldered to a piece of 1/64 flat bar. 1/32 square brass bar is an ideal fit inside the 1/16 square tube, making it possible to leave the mud flaps removable. Here's a look at the finished pair of mud flaps after final painting and weathering installed on the truck. Kenworth kit mud flaps were used in a similar manner on a different project, and this picture gives a better view of the bracket on the frame made of 1/16 square tube soldered to a piece of 1/64 brass flat bar with 2 styrene rivet heads. Finished Kenworth mud flaps with a pair of reflectors made for the bottom corners of each flap to hide the large sink marks rather than try to fill and sand them. If suitable mud flaps aren't available in a kit, you can easily scratch build your own. Here I'm using 015 styrene sheet for the main body of the flap, with 015 styrene strip applied to build the ribs. The resulting 30,007 inch thickness is a perfect match for the 1/32 square brass bar used to build the coiled bracket. Blue bracket and white mud flap are easy to do when the parts are separate pieces, the way we've built them here. A variation often seen on tractors is angling the outside edge of the mud flap bracket down at about a 45-degree angle to make it less likely for the mud flap and bracket to hang up on the trailer when turning sharp corners, especially on uneven terrain. The mud flap itself is simply cut off at an angle to match and then bolted in place. Model mud flap brackets can be built the same way, using the same basic procedures that we already used on the straight mud flap bracket. This Peterbilt 378 actually has both straight and angle brackets on the rear drive axles, as per the real truck. Here the brackets have been coiled, bent to the appropriate shape and cut to length, and just need to have the shim brass strips added. Mud flaps with the top angled corners were scratch built using the same procedure, starting with 015 styrene sheet and filling with 015 styrene strip for the ribs. Use putty or primer surfacer as required to clean up any imperfections at the joints where the different rib sections come together to create the illusion of the finished mud flap being one solid piece molded from rubber. For this model, decals were drawn on a simple CAD program and printed on clear decal paper to simulate the logos applied to the real mud flaps. A great advantage of building the mud flap and the bracket as two separate parts is the ability to achieve a clean color separation in an installation like this, where the bracket and the mud flap are contrasting colors. The brass wire pins, after being cut to length at final assembly, are easily touched up with a fine brush. And we'll finish this look at mud flaps and brackets with a view of the finished Labatt's 378 installation, showing both styles of mud flap brackets on the same truck. Mud flaps are another one of those seemingly very simple details that with a little bit of extra work can greatly enhance the finished appearance of your model. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of this one. Coming up in the near future, I'll post another video still dealing with mud flaps, but showing a couple of different approaches you can use in addition to the one shown here.